Our guest on this week's TBR Radio Presents the Dixie Heritage Hour is Andy Calhoun. Andy is one of our Dixie Heritage subscribers, and he's recently written the book, Letters to My Darling Wife. I say written the book, actually the letters in the book, or the book itself, was written by his ancestor, John F. Calhoun, and they were the letters that he had written during the war between the states to his wife. And those letters had been in Andy Calhoun's family for over 150 years. And as Andy will tell us in the interview, he realized that these letters had been in his family for 150 years. And he said that he didn't want to be the one to lose them in a hurricane or in a flood or in a fire. And so he made the painstaking labor of love of transcribing them and then having them published in book form. Not only is Andy Calhoun a descendant of his ancestor John F. Calhoun, who had written the letters that became the book, he's also a descendant of Vice President John C. Calhoun. So he's able to share a lot of interesting history, Calhoun family history, the history of Vice President John Calhoun and some of his conflicts with President Andrew Jackson and some of the politics that led up to the war between the states. And also kind of gives a perspective of what a volunteer soldier's life was like in the war between the states, as his ancestor John Francis Calhoun writes to his darling wife. And so what we're going to do now is we're going to cut into that interview with Andy Calhoun.
Good morning, sir.
Why don't you start by telling us the story of how your family migrated from Ireland to Pennsylvania and then from Pennsylvania to Virginia?
Okay. Well, actually, the migration began in Scotland as far back as 1603. Alexander Calhoun was the chief of the clan at that time, and the Calhouns were feuding with the MacGregors, and the MacGregors kind of had a big massacre and the Glen Fruin. So King James, as a result of that, King James VI of Scotland awarded the Calhouns a land grant in the Ulster section of, which is now Northern Ireland. And Alexander Calhoun he didn't want to go because he was the chief of the clan in Scotland. So he gave the land grant to his son, who didn't want to go because he was a merchant. So Alexander's grandson, Robert Calhoun, ended up going from Scotland to Northern Ireland around 1629. And then they lived in Ulster for several generations. And Robert's great-grandson, James Patrick, who by this time they changed the spelling of the name to Calhoun. James Patrick and his family immigrated to Pennsylvania in 1733. And then they left I'm not clear on exactly what reason, but James Patrick died in Pennsylvania, and his widow and their 4 sons and daughters and families all left to Virginia, the Roanoke Valley in Virginia, 1746, and then on to South Carolina, to the Abbeville district of South Carolina in 1755, and they were there ever since.
Okay. And so then several of your ancestors had fought in the Revolutionary War?
Actually, yes, they did, and one of James Patrick's sons, or 2 of them actually, were members of a group up there in the Abbeville area that they call themselves the Long Cane Regulators. And they were in a little militia group, and they were quoted as saying they wreaked havoc and rendered themselves obnoxious to the British and their Indian allies in the upstate of South Carolina. But the larger involvement of one of my ancestors was by my 4th great-grandfather, who was General Andrew Pickens from up in South Carolina. And Pickens was probably the lesser known of the 3 big militia generals in South Carolina, Francis Marion and Thomas Richmond. In the Midlands, Francis Marion from the Low Country, and then Andrew Pickens was from the Up Country. And he was awarded, made a brigadier general after fighting at the Battle of Cowpens, and was awarded a sword by the U.S. Congress for his service. So he was a little more involved in the Calhoun side of the generation, but they did fight in the Revolution.
Okay. And so your ancestors had already migrated then from Virginia to South Carolina before the Revolution and not afterwards.
Yes, that's correct. Actually, in 1755, the Calhouns left Virginia to South Carolina after the British General Braddock was he had the Fort Duquesne up in the Ohio Valley, and he was defeated by the French and Indians, and that exposed the whole Virginia frontier that lay below, exposed that to Indian attacks. So Calhouns all gathered up their goodies and left the Roanoke Valley and came down to the Abbeville district of South Carolina in 1755. So yeah, that was pretty well before the Revolution.
So what inspired them to leave Virginia and resettle in South Carolina? What was appealing down there to them?
Well, they were scared of Indian attacks after the British, who were the protectors at that point in time, the protectors of everybody up there. And after they were defeated, the Calhouns feared Indian attacks, and so they fled their farms and all and left for South Carolina, for the safety of the South Carolina.
Okay. And so then your book was actually a series of letters that was written by your ancestor, John Francis Calhoun.
Correct. He was my great-grandfather.
Okay. And if I understood what I read in the book correctly, he was one generation removed from Vice President John C. Calhoun.
Well, actually, it was two generations. He was he was a grand-nephew. In other words, John Francis's grandfather was John C. Calhoun's younger brother, Patrick Calhoun. So John Francis was actually the two generations removed from John C.
Okay. And I know that the book isn't about John C. Calhoun, but just because, unfortunately, we live in a day and an age when a lot of radio listeners are historically unlearned, I guess, nice way to put it, I don't know.
Yeah. Right.
Why don't you take just a couple minutes and tell us who John C. Calhoun was?
Well, John C. was he's probably one of the most brilliant political minds in America even today, I think, and he was way ahead of his time. But he was a powerful statesman, and I use the term statesman rather than saying politician, because a statesman will tell you the truth, and a politician will tell you what you think your people want to hear. So, but Calhoun supported states' rights and nullification and opposed unfair taxation on the South 3 decades before South Carolina finally was driven to secession in 1860. But he was involved in foreign affairs. He was a Secretary of War, a Secretary of State, and one of the major players in both the War of 1812 and the Mexican War. And Calhoun was as responsible as anyone for bringing the independent Republic of Texas into the Union back in those days. So he was entrenched he was a U.S. representative from South Carolina in the House of Representatives. He was a senator and left the Senate, and as you mentioned, he was a vice president under John Quincy Adams and later Andrew Jackson, who he couldn't get along with and had a history of disagreements with Andrew Jackson, going back as far as Jackson was in the Army in 1819 and Calhoun was the Secretary of War. So they had a long and troubled history together. And so finally, when Calhoun was his vice president, things came to an head. And Calhoun was the first vice president in the history of the country. Of course, there was only 7 of them by that time, but Calhoun resigned the vice presidency and returned to the Senate to represent South Carolina, and where he served the rest of his career.
It's interesting because I think if most school children at some point can recite the names of the presidents, if for no other reason because they make you memorize them at some point in elementary school. But
right.
You're not required to memorize the names of the vice presidents. And so the names of the vice presidents by and large, have been lost to history. Of course, there are exceptions to that rule. You know, those who went on to become president themselves.
Right.
But what makes John C. Calhoun unique is he never served as president, and yet he's probably the most easily recalled vice president of all of history.
Well, he entertained a run, as I'm sure you're aware, for the presidency around 1840 or so. And in fact, I'm sure you're aware, you know, that when they voted, the guy that got all the most votes was the president, and the guy that got the second most votes was the vice president. So Calhoun did that twice. He wasn't able to, as you mentioned, serve as president, but served 1.5 terms, I guess would be the correct way to say it, as vice president. But I'm guilty of that too. I couldn't tell you who all the vice presidents were. The only other one I can remember right off the top of my head is Spiro Agnew under Nixon, because he resigned. He was the second vice president to resign.
I will say, you know, it would be it could be a Jeopardy question just to remember the names of all of Nixon's vice presidents. He had so many of them.
That's right. Exactly.
But so tell us a little bit about your, I guess your great, your ancestor would have been John C. Calhoun's nephew, John F. Calhoun.
Right. John F. Calhoun. Right. And
tell us about John F. Calhoun.
Well, John Francis was born in 1831 up in the Abbeville district, or they call it the Calhoun settlement, actually. And that's where John C., his uncle John C., was born, in the same area there. And they all grew up there. And John Francis grew up, and was the oldest of 10 children. Well, his father was named Edward, and they lived in a little area called Willington, South Carolina, which is about 10 miles south of Abbeville, South Carolina. And Willington is still a census town. It's a dead town now, but it's still represented on the census. And there's only about 120 people, I think, today that live in Willington. But he was raised up on the farm and was surprisingly well educated, and had a teacher. They just prepared you. They call it being prepared for college. So he, you know, I had no formal schooling, just was prepared, and took a test and was placed in the junior class of South Carolina College, which is now University of South Carolina in Columbia. And he attended there in 1851. And in 1852, during his senior year, he left school. And I inquired as to what were the reasons he left school. And they told me, I was talking to the people at the University of South Carolina, and they said, well, he probably left as a result of what they called the Great Biscuit Rebellion. And I said, okay. What? And the lady archivist up there began to tell me the Great Biscuit Rebellion was at that time in 1852, all the students in the school were required to take their meals in the campus or the college mess hall. And the mess hall had acquired a reputation of serving wormy biscuits and rancid beef in the mess hall. So all the students took an honor-bound pledge and said, "You've got to let us eat somewhere else. We can't do this anymore." And the trustees of the college said, "No, you got to stay here." So I think it was 109 out of 199 students at the time just walked out and left college. So John Francis returned to Willington and farmed there with his father until he got married in 1859, and then of course in 1860 all the turmoil began, and he volunteered 3 days after Fort Sumter, which was April 12th of 1861. On April the 15th, he walked away from his farm and his wife, and by then he had a 8 infant child, and he said, it's time for me to go. I got to volunteer. And he got on the train and went to Charleston and volunteered in the Confederate Army.
So at the time that he volunteered, at the time that the war began, would you say, of course, he lived on a farm, and a farm could mean anything from he was plowing his own field to he was a gentleman member of the aristocracy and owned a plantation and watched other people work. There's a large spectrum of
Yeah, exactly. And that's why I use the term farm. I think what he had in Wellington there was far from a plantation. But I will say, and we discovered he had 9 slaves that worked, and he also owned a grist mill, and part of the grist mill was a leather tannery. So he had a tannery, a farm, and a grist mill, all that were operated by himself and some family members, and then he had 9 slaves as labor assistants. So yeah, it was not a plantation. It was a farm.
So was he, being the nephew of a former vice president means he could have been in the upper crust of society, but it doesn't necessarily mean that. So where do you think he fell in kind of the social caste of the day?
I think I would probably venture to say he was kind of in the middle of the pack there. I mean, he wasn't aristocracy, I would think, a well-to-do, but he survived. But on the other hand, he was not, a pauper either.
Right.
So he took care of his family. He had himself only one child at the time these letters were written. He and his wife Rebecca only had one child. But as soon as he got out of the Army in 1864 and was released, but then the next decade or so, they had 9 children.
Okay.
So, but yeah, and they, they provided and they did well and they survived. And of course, as with many other Southern families, they took a beating and after the war and Reconstruction. But that's another story.
Right. So these letters that you've published between John Francis Calhoun and his wife Rebecca, how did you come into possession of the letters?
Well, several of John Francis's own letters that he wrote to his wife Rebecca, he asks her, and just to quickly quote one of them, he says, "Now, darling, you must not destroy those letters, for I prize them highly. And if I am spared to reach home safely, I wish to read them over." So Rebecca kept the letters, and when John Francis passed away, and then Rebecca lived till 1918, she gave them to her daughter, who was named Ida Calhoun, and Ida kept them. And when Ida began to get old, she gave them to my father's older brother, my uncle, and his name was John Calhoun. And my Uncle John kept them until 2007. And when he died, he gave them to me, and I've had them since 2007. So John Francis's wishes were carried out. They stayed in the family for 150 something years.
So then you said you had them until 2007. What did you do with them in 2007?
No, actually, that's when I gained possession of them, was in 2007, and didn't think a whole lot of it. They stayed on the shelf, and my wife and I read them every now and again, and looked through some of them, and decided on a lark to start transcribing some of them, which we did. And then finally we decided, we're down here in Hurricane Alley on the East Coast of Savannah. So I said, these letters have lasted 150 years. I don't want to be the guy to lose them in a flood or a hurricane or fire or something. So we need to do something with them. So my wife and I began the journey of transcribing them. And after we'd done about 15 or 20, I made an appointment with Karen Stokes, the archivist over at the South Carolina Historical Society in Charleston. And I asked her, I said, "What have I got here?" And I took the letters and some of the transcriptions. I said, "I'm just looking to see what I got." And she just went, "Holy moly, you got a historical treasure chest there. You got to do something with them." So we came back home from Charleston and began in earnest to transcribe them. And there was around 100 letters total, and that we transcribed and decided to try to publish them.
I think this will be a good place to pause and take a short break. We'll have just a brief commercial message from our sponsor, the Barnes Review, and then we'll be back with our guest, Andy Calhoun. If you love listening to the Dixie Heritage Hour, then I know that you'll love reading the Barnes Review. The Barnes Review is one of my favorite magazines. I began reading the Barnes Review long before they became a sponsor here on the program. In the Barnes Review, you will read vignettes of man, from the prehistoric to the very recent, from forgotten races and civilizations to first-person accounts of World War II and the late Cold War. There's just not a more interesting magazine published today, nor a more significant and important subject than real history. So if you'll visit www.barnesreview.org, that's www.barnesreview.org, you can find out how you too can become a subscriber to the Barnes Review. You can subscribe to receive the Barnes Review by mail, or you can subscribe to receive the Barnes Review electronically in PDF editions. Or you can subscribe to receive both. That's what I do. So visit www.barnesreview.org and subscribe to the Barnes Review. We're back on the Dixie Heritage Hour, and our guest is Andy Calhoun, descendant of John C. Calhoun, former Vice President of the United States, and editor of the book Letters to My Darling Wife, the letters written by Confederate volunteer John Francis Calhoun during the war between the states.
So I know that paper was very scarce to come by, especially the longer the war went on.
Right, exactly.
Harder paper. So did your ancestors ever mention anything as to what they had to do just to keep the paper to write the letters?
He mentions in several of the letters that somebody was always running, but he was deployed up on the Potomac River in Manassas and fought in First Manassas and so forth. But they would send to Charlottesville or Richmond or somewhere to try to. Somebody out of their unit would always go make a paper run, go get paper for letter writing. And interestingly, some of the letters as the war began just were single sheet letters. He'd write on single sheets, and as the year went on, paper, as you mentioned, paper got more scarce. And so what he would do is he'd take a piece of paper and he would write left to right across the page. And then once he got to the bottom of the page, he'd turn it 90 degrees and then write perpendicular across what he had just written.
Wow.
So that, you talk about a nightmare trying to transcribe these things. That's because they had to save paper. So they wrote left to right and then turned it and then wrote perpendicular to what he had just written to finish his letters.
Well, I know that when I was writing my book on the Christian testimony of Jeb Stuart,
mm-hmm.
of the Stuart family, had given me several of General Stuart's letters, as well as his diaries, his poetry books. It was all handwritten. I would, myself personally, I could not read more of it than I could read. I'm just a combination of his penmanship being poor, and of course a lot of it was written in the saddle, so it was shaky anyways because
right.
he was riding on a moving horse. And part of it is just we're used to reading type now. We're not used to reading longhand anymore.
Exactly. Yes, sir.
And so did you find these letters difficult to read and transcribe?
Initially, yes, terribly difficult. But my wife and I both, we stuck with it, and you'd start to read them, and you couldn't understand or couldn't determine what letter, of the alphabet was what sometimes. And given that and the terminology, they used a different term. Like if you were to say, I met John Smith 10 days ago, they would write, I met John Smith 10 days since. And so since meant ago.
Okay.
And so you'd figure out these little different terminologies. But once you sat down with them and got in it sounds crazy, but once you got in a particular mindset, you could start to understand, you began to understand what words were what. And you could develop a pattern of knowing how he wrote and what he was writing about. So as the project went on, it became a little easier to understand what the writing was.
I know these letters were important. Of course, you mentioned it, that John Francis had asked his wife to save the letters.
Yeah.
Like, for example, on June 26, 1861, he wrote this. He said, "This will be the 11th letter that I have written to you since leaving South Carolina, and only one has been received in reply. What in the world is the matter? Surely you don't write twice a week as I have requested. Do you wish me to write 2 or 3 times a week? You must certainly know how anxious I am to hear from my little family." He was frustrated by the fact that his wife wasn't writing as frequently as he wanted for her to. About a month later, he wrote this. He said, "I have written to you 11 times, and this will be 12. 3 have been received in reply, but I am expecting one today. When you write, always let me know how many letters you have received." So not only was he concerned about whether or not she was writing him enough, he was concerned by, how dependable the mail service was.
Well, yeah, he was very concerned about just the news from home and what was going on at his mill and farm and so forth, as well as just communicating obviously with his wife. And and he chastised her frequently throughout the book and all these letters, frequently about not writing. And he scolded her more than once about not writing to him. And they, as you mentioned, he began to number the letters, and so you could tell if any crossed in the mail, because obviously the mails were a little strung out at that point in time.
And this is still early in the war, July 31st, 1861. It appears he's already began keeping a log of the dates that he writes the letters, the dates that he mails the letters, and that she claims to have received the letters. It seems a little it seems a little much for a correspondence between husband and wife.
Oh, he was definitely putting the pressure. And I've had several of my friends who have gotten books and read them. They said, "Golly, he was kind of mean to her." I said, "Well, he wanted some communication. He was concerned about his business and his family and everything else. So he wanted that information coming back, and just it was slow coming." But interestingly, I've had several people ask me, said, "Why didn't you have any letters from Rebecca?" And I don't know if you read that part, but he had mentioned one letter, I don't remember particularly when, but he said something to the effect of, I read last night all your letters to me and enjoyed them and blah, blah, blah. And then he says, and then I committed them to the flames for not wanting the enemy or not wanting them to fall into the hands of the enemy. So that's why her letters were not kept, because he ended up burning most of them.
Well, I did notice in reading his letters that the things that he would write to her would definitely be censored out of letters that soldiers would write today. He was very specific as to their locations, their movements.
Right, yeah.
Had the enemy gotten a hold of his letters, they would have been an intelligence treasure trove. And
he acknowledged at one time that he was going to have to start cutting back on the information that he was telling her, but I don't think he ever did.
Do you think that Rebecca wasn't writing because she was just too busy managing everything in his absence, or do you think that she didn't write because she really didn't care to write, or why do you think that disparity was?
I'm not sure, but I think that's probably the case. He had left her to. Now she was, I think I remember saying she was 22 years old at that point in time, and had a young child that was born in early 1860 or August of 1860. So she'd have been 6 or 8 months old. So between raising an 8-month-old daughter and trying to help manage the mill and the farm, and then her father was a farmer as well, and she helped John Francis's father was a farmer. So I guess she was stayed pretty busy all the time,
right,
rather than sit down to write.
Of course, we don't have her letters as a comparison. I'm assuming that she was,
right,
because she was writing some letters. So,
well, I do have about 7 or 8 of her letters that survived, and I just elected not to include those in the book because there was just so few of them.
But in reading her letters, does it appear that she was intelligent and everything, or?
Oh yeah.
So writing was a struggle for her.
A legible handwriting, more so than John Francis probably.
Okay, so then letter writing was not a struggle for her.
No, I don't believe so. No.
Okay.
But she was an interesting character too, because her maiden name was Noble, and she was the grandniece of former South Carolina Governor Patrick Noble. and she was a great-granddaughter of General Andrew Pickens. So the Calhouns and the Pickens and the Nobles were all tied up together there for generations.
Well, you said that the family originated in Scotland.
Yep.
And, if you go back to Scotland and even Ireland as well, but especially in Scotland, you married within the clan.
Oh, yeah, yeah.
And that's what a lot of people don't realize. They think that, they make the jokes about inbred Southerners and so forth, Southerners marrying their cousins and whatnot. But that's what it really comes back to is that's the tradition of marrying inside your clan.
Well, mobility was limited, so you didn't get far outside of the community. And in fact, John Francis's wife, Rebecca, was his third cousin.
So were there any particular letters that struck you as being more interesting than others as you were transcribing and putting them together?
Yeah, there was a couple that I was interested in. And once I mentioned the Pickens part of the thing, he wrote in late April, after he was being trained in Charleston, Governor Francis Pickens, who was the South Carolina governor at that time, had come down to Charleston to meet with all the new recruits. And he was imploring upon the new South Carolina volunteers that he wanted them to go to Virginia and be deployed along the Potomac River and defend Virginia. And the South Carolinians all said, no, we're not going to go. We volunteered to fight for South Carolina, not Virginia. And he said, at that point in time, in April of 61, I think Virginia had not yet seceded. So he writes in his letter, he says, Becca, I have not for many years had much fancy for Governor Pickens, and now I dislike him more than ever. Well, Governor Pickens was his wife Rebecca's first cousin, actually. So I just thought that was a little ironic. He's telling his wife she didn't like her cousin. But another one was he gave. I'm sure you probably read this part, but on July 22nd, he gave a pretty accurate and provocative account of the Battle of First Manassas. It has title on Bull Run's Creek on July 22nd, and he wrote in there, I thought it would be a deadly fight. One regiment after another dashed through the creek and whirled right to the left to attack them on both sides. Bonham's brigade on the right and General Longstreet's on the left, and on we dashed with deafening shouts. Well, as everybody knows, those deafening shouts was what soon to become the legendary rebel yell. And then another one that I thought was really interesting, and he called it providential, but it was in August of 1861. He said, I forgot to mention that the Yankees came in 10 or 15 minutes of capturing General Beauregard a few days ago. He and a body of cavalry as an escort went to or near Mount Vernon reconnoitering, and being fatigued, they halted to rest. General Beauregard and a few others rode on around the vicinity, and while he was gone, the cavalry of the enemy surrounded those that were left and took everyone prisoner. It seems providential that General Beauregard rode off when he did, and another remarkable instance of divine interposition on our behalf. They said they wondered what was going to happen to Beauregard if he was captured. They said that might have changed things early on.
Yeah, well, General Beauregard was not. How do I say this? He was probably he probably did well as an administrative general,
right?
But I do not know that he really was effective at commanding troops in the field.
Well, everything John Francis writes in here, he admires Beauregard, and I think they reassigned him towards the end of that year, or right after the first of 1862. So they were a little disappointed that he was reassigned from out of the Army of the Potomac, or the Army of Northern Virginia. But one letter that's in December of 1861 kind of, to me, sums up the attitude of the Confederate soldier statesman when John Francis writes about a Virginian chief of artillery, Colonel Pendleton, proposed and set on foot a plan to raise a subscription for those in Charleston who were sufferers from the Great Fire. Well, early in December, there was a big fire, as I'm sure you probably remember history there, that burned about 500 acres in the Charleston Peninsula. Here were these soldiers living up there in the snow and ice and foraging for food. He said this plan was to raise money by each volunteer giving so much a day's pay, 1, 2, or even 3 days, and for the amount to be deducted from their next pay. So I just find it amazing that, here they are fighting for their lives, living outdoors, so forth and so on, and not having a regular or dependable pay schedule, that they were willing to give up 1 or 2 or 3 days pay to send the people in Charleston who they didn't know, but were victims of a great fire. So there they were defending the country there and worried about their people in Charleston. I just find that astounding.
That seems to be even the case today, I would say, with a lot of soldiers. I think that as you see the horrors of war, I think that in some cases it probably makes you more hard-hearted, but I think in a lot of cases it makes these men even more sensitive to suffering and tragedy.
Yes, sir. I agree.
Once again, we're going to pause here and we're going to have a brief word from our sponsor, the American Free Press. If you're like me, and I'll bet you are because you're listening to the Dixie Heritage Hour, you like to be on the cutting edge of honest news and accurate information. You like to hear about the latest financial trends and to know what's happening around the world and right here in the United States, the things that can directly impact you, your life, and the life of your family. And if you're like me, you do not rely on the mainstream media to obtain this information because, frankly, you know that you just can't trust them. Fortunately, there is an alternative news outlet with a long-established track record for honesty and integrity, and that is the American Free Press. AFP is the preeminent alternative, independent news source for honest, hard-working, truth-loving Americans. AFP is the antithesis of the controlled, lamestream media. AFP is employee-owned and has been so since its founding. Because of that, AFP never has and never will allow advertisers or special interests or big money to dictate what appears in the pages of the American Free Press newspaper. 26 times a year, the American Free Press newspaper can be delivered to your door, packed with the kind of uncensored news that I know you're going to appreciate. AFP covers the stories and tells the truth that the lamestream media is frankly scared to touch. And AFP offers real, on-the-scene reporting and commentary, the likes of which you will never see in the Washington Post, the New York Times, ABC, NBC, CBS, CNN, or just about any other lamestream news source that you can think of. That's right, there's only one national populist news weekly staffed by an unsurpassed team of veteran investigative journalists who will dare to rip the veil off of many of the major news stories that are being censored and suppressed by the big money controlled media monopoly. And that's the American Free Press. AFP publishes exciting, in-depth, uncensored news and information that's grassroots and patriotic, information that Americans need to know in order to combat the growing police state. AFP stands firmly against the New World Order and against those who are working to establish a global plantation under the rule of a powerful few. In short, AFP is your voice. If you have any doubt why they want to silence AFP, you must be relying on the lamestream media for your news, and folks, that's a big mistake. If you're ever dissatisfied with your subscription to the American Free Press, their guarantee is that you just drop them an email and they will gladly refund the unused portion of your subscription. So what are you waiting for? Visit www.americanfreepress.net. Once again, www.americanfreepress.net. And find out about the American Free Press. Do it today. And we're back with our guest, Andy Calhoun.
I have to confess that I only made it about halfway through the book before the interview.
Yeah.
And I didn't pick up any... I didn't see the undertowing romance in what I had read. Does that pick up later in the war? Is there separated further, or does the tone of the letters change more, or did it stay about the same? Or
Well, it did change a little bit because I noticed early on in the letters he would write to Rebecca that when I return home. And then, about halfway through, he says, should I return home? And then towards the end of the year, like in March of 1862, he says, if I return home. So as things moved on, it became very unclear. As you know, that they thought the war was only going to last a couple of months in the beginning. So as things began to wear on, they became a little confused about what was going to happen and how long they were going to stay in the Army. And he actually joined and volunteered as what they called a 12-month volunteer. So his first term was from April 61 to March of 62. That was his 12 months. And had been promised as a volunteer that they would be allowed to be furloughed and go home to check on homestead, family, and business and what have you. And they never were granted furloughs. So as the letters drug on, he became more and more upset at the fact that he was not allowed to go home. And he and many of the other officers had all threatened to resign their commissions and just get out of the Army. And his sense of duty and responsibility overcame that, and he stayed in the Army for his full 12 months without receiving a furlough and never going home. And then they promised some of the enlisted men. He was a second lieutenant, so an officer. He was not given a furlough, but the enlisted men, they said if they re-enlisted, they would be given a furlough. So the enlisted men, some of them did receive furloughs, but the officers did not, and that in that first year anyway.
right.
So he got out. He was released in March, the end of March of 62, and the Confederate Congress in April of 62, and I don't remember the exact date, but they passed the Conscription Act, or a Conscription Act that required everybody from all men 18 to 45 be in the service. Well, so he found himself right back in the service again. And then a week after the Conscription Act was passed, the Congress passed what they call the Vital Occupations Act, or Exemption Act, which allowed that if you were a doctor, lawyer, teacher, educator, businessman that ran in several different kind of businesses, you would be exempted from service. So he was back in under the Conscription Act, and he ran that tannery, so he was exempted a week later. So he went back home for a while, and then stayed out, and then got back in and re-enlisted, and was with a completely different Confederate unit when he went back in. So he served his first year as a second lieutenant, but when he went back in 62, he was a private.
Okay.
And he ended up, went 2 or 3 out again, in again, out again, in again, and finally in 1864 he wrote a petition because in 1862, late 1862, his tannery signed a contract with a Confederate quartermaster to supply leather goods to the Confederate Army. So that was another part of his exemption, was being able to get out because he had that contract with the Confederate government. But he stayed in the Army and had a partner that was supposed to be administering that contract and had failed to get it done. And he petitioned the War Department in early 1864 to let him out according to the Exemptions Act and so forth, so he could go home and administer the contract with the Confederate Army, and ultimately was allowed to do that. So he got out in 1864 and was not in the Army towards the end of the war.
Well, I noticed in some of the letters, especially the earlier letters, that he was asking Rebecca for articles of clothing, and even there were pistols and weapons that he wanted to purchase from other family members.
Right.
So I'm guessing that even though he had enlisted in the Army, that they weren't equipping them perhaps as well as you would think an Army would equip its soldiers, because they're having to try to procure their their stuff elsewhere.
That's exactly true. The Union, the Yankees, if you will, they already had a standing army, as everybody knows. So they already were equipped and had a standing army in the South. The Confederates had to come up with their own. So he had to get his own horse. He had to get his own pistol or weapons or swords or whatever it was he used in the weapons of war. And the army had to start their own munitions places and get ammunition and all. There were women's, as they call them, women's societies. And so there was a big group of women's society there in Abbeville, South Carolina, that they would all get together and sew uniforms and socks and underwear, and they called them drawers. He says he sent me a couple of pair of drawers. But they had to get everything themselves. I think later on, after that first year, the quartermasters began to accumulate some supplies that they could distribute a little easier and a little better. But for that first year, they had to come up with their own supplies.
Well, I also noticed, too, that on his birthday in 1861, we talked before how sometimes he was a little hard on his wife. He chastised her. In fact, he asked her, he says, "Have you forgotten that this is my birthday? And did you think of it?"
Yeah.
But after that, he began to ask for shoes.
Apparently, as time went on, he was selling shoes to his troops or his fellow officers. You probably read, where he said, "Well, this one didn't fit me, so I'm going to sell it to Colonel Smith or whatever, Colonel Jones, and then send me another pair."
And so
I imagine he was a popular guy if he could provide somebody a pair of shoes.
And there's also a letter there where he's talking about trying to get his father-in-law to ship hay, because I guess they were having a hard time getting hay for their horses and stuff. And so, again, the things that you think the Army would just be taking care of, they weren't.
Yeah, he did that. And another interesting, he recognized fairly early on, after the Yankee blockade was enforced, he wrote to his father and Rebecca and her father and advised them to stop growing cotton. He said because the blockade was holding up raw materials, or raw cotton could not be exported, nor could finished goods be imported because of the blockade. So he said, look, the Army's got to be fed, the horses got to be fed, the cows, mules, everything has to be fed. So start growing foodstuffs and quit growing cotton. So that was his advice about halfway through the years to switch that, because he could sell the foodstuffs, beans and whatever else they could grow, corn, etc. They could sell that, but they couldn't sell the cotton. The cotton bottomed out.
So the property that this farm was on, is it still in your family today?
No, it's long gone. I think the Corps of Engineers owns it. I've stood on it. I've been to the property a number of times up there, and it actually was on the Savannah River, and then what is now called, I guess, Lake Russell, which is part of the dam system that goes up the Savannah River. But yeah, it's a beautiful high bluff piece of property, but it was passed on. I think John Francis and his family ended up losing most of what they had in Reconstruction, because in 1880 he had to go find a job. They sold I found the deeds where they sold the property to neighbors, and then lost the rest of it. And he took a job in a little town of Due West, South Carolina. There was a teacher's college there, and he took a job as traveling all over South Carolina finding jobs for the female teaching graduates. So, the property passed on, and I think today all that property up there is owned by the Corps of Engineers. But it's beautiful. I wish I could get it back. Well, John Francis's father, Edwards, built a house there in that same little Willington area in 1856, and that house is still standing today and is still occupied. And we went and visited. I visited there last fall. I was up there and visited the people that own the house, and it's still standing, still solid as a rock.
So does anybody in your family still have any of the old family property, or has it all been lost?
Yeah, it's pretty much, best of my knowledge, it's all been lost. Both John Francis and Rebecca and the noble side of the family, I think, lost everything up there as well. As I say, he took a job with this little female college there in Due West. And just a quick epilogue as to what happened. When Thomas Clemson, as you know, married John C. Calhoun's daughter, Anna, and they inherited John C.'s house up there in South Carolina, which is now in the middle of Clemson University. But Clemson inherited everything, and when he died in 1888 and left the estate, what was left of the Calhoun estate and all up there, he left it to the South Carolina to build a college. Provisos in his will was that someone from the Calhoun family they wanted to make Fort Hill a museum as a tribute to his father-in-law, John C. Calhoun. So they said they wanted to hire someone from the Calhoun family to come there and live and take care of the museum. So that was John Francis Calhoun and Rebecca. They were both hired by Clemson College in its early days, as early as 1891, and the college opened in 1893, and they were some of the first employees. He ran the dining hall on campus. She was a dormitory matron, and his other duty was he was the keeper of the relic room, which was, I guess we'd call a curator today. So they lived in Fort Hill at Clemson College, and he died in 1897. But his son, my grandfather, was living with them at the time, and my grandfather was one of the first 400 students to enter Clemson College in 1893, and was one of the first 18 graduates, 20 some odd graduates in 1896. So, and he was a day student, lived in the Fort Hill house while he was going to college. And so my dad, after returning from World War II, Dad went back and to Clemson and enrolled and graduated in 1950. And I did not graduate, but I was a student there for the early 1970s. So we've had 3 generations of the family involved in the Clemson College up there, but the family stayed closely allied to the university.
So why did you not stay and graduate? Just their life?
Well, it's kind of you go to an all-you-can-eat buffet, and finally some guy taps you on the shoulder and says, "That's all you can eat." They told me that if I wasn't going to go to class and I wasn't going to study, that I couldn't hang around there anymore.
Okay.
I absolutely love the place, and I was there 3 years and probably changed majors 3 or 4 times. So I had a lot of hours, but none of them all in one discipline. But it's a beautiful place. My younger brother did graduate there in 1980, and my dad's older brother was a 1932 graduate and was on the board of trustees till his death in 1976. So it's what was the old saying? Our blood runs orange.
Did at least in a couple of the letters talked about going to Sabbath services and things, but I don't necessarily see. Okay, for example, if you read the letters of Jeb Stuart to his wife,
Mm-hmm.
They talk a lot of God, of faith, of church, of those things. Robert E. Lee was the same way in a lot of his letters. I see some passing references in your ancestors' letters, but I don't see a large volume of it. I mean, I'm assuming they were Christian people.
Absolutely, yeah.
Yeah.
They were Presbyterians, and he wrote in several letters, he complained to Rebecca, saying that when they first were deployed and the Army first was sent to Virginia, each and every unit had a chaplain, and the chaplain would give services every Sunday, given the circumstances. But it says as time wore on, the chaplains either just, for whatever reason, I don't really know, but would leave the units or go somewhere else. And he was, John Francis wrote in there, and and I can't recall exactly when or where, but I do remember he wrote several letters saying that he was very upset that they didn't rely on the hand of God, the hand of providence, to be with them anymore as they had in early on, because each unit had its own chaplain.
So is there? I know that there's a John C. Calhoun, the society, for ancestors or descendants of John C. Calhoun. Is there is for your branch of the family? Is there some type of a organization that y'all have, or?
It's a little, I guess. Yeah, the answer is yes, but it's a little broader there. We go back to the Scottish Cahoons, which was spelled Colquhoun, but pronounced Cahoon. And there is a clan Cahoon society in the U.S. and internationally, but there's a lot of descendants from the U.S. Calhouns, obviously, that are part of that organization, including me.
Right. And so
but as far as just a Calhoun descendants society, if you will, no, we don't have one of those that to my knowledge.
Okay. And so has your publication of these letters, has it gotten a lot of attention within the clan society, or?
Yeah, there's going to be a big coming up in November this year, a big the Highland Games or Scottish Games in Charleston. So I've been asked to speak about the Calhoun migration and then descendants of John C. because he's buried there in Charleston. So we're looking forward to participating in that. But we did have only one that's been in my lifetime, a large Calhoun reunion, and it was hosted at Clemson University back in 1993. And we had about 300 people attend that were Calhouns from all across the country, and had a 3-day event celebrating the family and trading genealogy information and so forth. But for whatever the reason, we have not been able to put something like that back together again.
Have you actually taken pictures of the letters?
Yes, I have scanned each and every one of them.
Okay. So that somewhere along the way, then, when the actual paper that they're written on is gone, I guess there'll still be a facsimile image that someone could look at maybe one day.
Right, exactly. And my plan is to sometime this summer, I'm going to go and I've arranged to put these letters on deposit with South Carolina Historical Society, that the same Karen Stokes who got me started on this endeavor. I'm going to, put them on donation or deposit or whatever you call it there. So I'll let them keep it in their fireproof building, and then with the proper acid-free stuff and all. Because actually the letters are in incredibly good condition for as old as they are. Yeah. And still, he used ink in most of them. There's a couple that he wrote in pencil, which have obviously faded, but the ink letters, which is the majority of them, are still in incredibly good condition and entirely legible. If you can understand, once you get to read the handwriting, but right. They're completely legible, yeah.
And so the ink didn't smear or anything or expand on the paper over the years?
No, actually not. No, it's pretty good. They're in unbelievable shape, yeah.
Well, why don't you tell us, how does someone go about getting a copy of the book?
Published by Shotwell Publishing. They specialize in Southern nonfiction. But it's also available on Amazon.com, sells it, and then I think Barnes & Noble has it available as well. Whoa. So I'm very, very proud of it and proud of my family, in spite of all the political correctness going on today when I'm not supposed to be proud of my hair.
Once again, that's our show. I hope that this week's edition of TBR Radio Presents the Dixie Heritage Hour was enjoyable for you. Thank you for taking the time to listen, and I hope that you got something out of the interview with Andy Calhoun, something that perhaps made you rethink some aspect of history or of the war between the states, or the importance of family and the importance of preserving our family's history. Until next week, I hope that you'll join us again. And I hope that you'll go to our website, www.dixieheritage.net. You can sign up for my newsletter absolutely free, no obligation, and also get a free copy of my book. Go to Amazon.com, check out Andy Calhoun's wonderful book, Letters to My Darling Wife. And so until next week, we look forward to seeing you again.